Perek Aleph Mishnah Daled, a long Mishnah. Barzel Tomei Shebeloloi in Barzel Toir. You have a mixture of two metals, one of which is Tomei, or at least Sophic Tomei. Barzel, that if you were to make a keli out of it again, it would be Chozer Tumosai Shona, as mentioned in the previous Mishnahs. And you mix it together with a Barzel, which is definitely Toir. For instance, the Barzels which you mentioned at the beginning of Mishnah Gimel, for which you don't have the rule of Tumah Yeshana. And then you make a keli out of this composite metal. What is the din? Is it Chozer Tumah Yeshana of the Barzel Tomei, or is it the Barzel Tor which will determine the status of this new kli? This Mishnah must not be confused with Mishnahs which we'll be dealing later on, when we actually have a kli made of two parts. For instance, the right side will be made of one metal, and the second side will be made out of a different metal, or a wood, or a plastic. There we're dealing with different materials making up different parts of the kli. That's a separate din. We're dealing here with one material which itself is made up of a composite mixture of different materials. So then we go according to Roiv. Im Roiv min ha-tomei tomei. If Roiv is the Barzel Tomei, the Barzel for which the rules of Tumah Yeshana will apply, then you go Basa Roiv, and this whole metal is considered to be a Tumah Yeshana type of metal. Im Roiv min ha-Tor. If Roiv comes from the Barzel Tor, then you can go according to the Roiv. Mechza le-mechza, we're machmir, and we say Tomei. This is similar. This has nothing to do with bittul of Tumah. We're not being mevatel Tumah here. We're not dealing with taruvas. We're dealing here with a concept very similar to the concept which we find in Kelaim, when we have a wool, and the wool itself is made up of a mixture of sheep's wool and camel's wool. Then this new wool its status will be determined by the majority. This has nothing to do with bittul and taruvas. This is how we determine the status of this new wool, by saying, is it roiv tzemer gemalim? Then it's not called tzemer. If it's roiv tzemer rochelim, it's called tzemer. And the same here as well. It's the roiv that will determine the status of this new metal. Different ways of learning this. Bartanura learns we're talking about a mixture of chaloma and glolim. Here we're not talking about metal. Chaloma is a type of clay, and glolim is dung. The clay part will actually form a kli cheres. The glolim part will render the kli a kli glolim. If you have a mixture of clay and glolim, then it's the roiv which will, if it's roiv min chaloma, it'll have a din of kli cheres. If it's roiv min glolim, it'll have a din of kli glolim. Mechza le-mechza will be machmir and give it a din of kli cheres. And the Mishnah carries on. Klustero Timea u'metzupa tahira. Different ways of learning this Mishnah. We will learn the more simple way, which is the perish of the Rambam, who does not learn this din with the dinim of Tumah Yeshana. He's learning this din as a din in its own right. You have a klustera. We said before in Mishnah base that if you have a metal bolt behind the door, then that bolt is tar because it's nasa lechabe imakarka. That's if it's a straightforward bolt called a neger. However, what they used to have, at one end of the bolt they had a ball, a rounded end, and this part of the kli could actually be used for something else. It was actually used as a grinder, as something to, I'm not sure which one, the mortar or the pestle, to grind in herbs and garlic. Of course, then it would have its own identity, not l'chabe makarka, and it would be mekabel tumah under the normal rules. And that's why the Mishnah says Tamea, because the rounded part of the end changes it from this basic neger we had before in Mishnah base, which is Torah, to a regular kitchen utensil, and it's now Tomei. Says the Mishnah, Metzupa Tahira. However, if we have a wooden bolt like this, and it's got this rounded end, under the rules of wood, it's called a pshuta kliate because wood has to have a kli kibble. But you plate it with metal, so the main part of the kli, the bulk of the kli is wood, is metal plated. Now, what does this new kli have? What din does it have? Is it kli 8 because that's the ikka part of the kli, or do you go according to the tzipui, which is the outside? So this Mishnah says tahira that you don't go bossa the tzipui. You go bossa the ikka kli, which is made out of 8s, and therefore it's tahir. Now this rule of tzipui comes actually many times in Shas and many times in this Perik, and there seem to be contradictions. Sometimes you find, as like in this Mishnah, that you don't go bossa tzipui. You go bossa the ik of the kli, which is wood, and therefore in this case it would be tar. And there are other sugyas which say quite clearly that tzipui is the one which determines the status of the kli. And according to that, this keli should be tomei. So the Mefarshim explain, the Chazon Ish and others say, that it all depends on what the tzipui does. If the tzipui is there just for plain ornamental purposes, as it would be in this case, then you do not follow the tzipui. The ikka is the main part of the kli, the thing which is being covered. However, if the tzipui actually contributes and assists in the function of the kli, for instance, if you would have a wooden pole as a weapon, and you plate it with metal so that it is harder and tougher and hits harder, then the metal actually serves the function of the kli, then you would go bossa tzipui. And the Mishnah carries on with another case, hapin v'hapurno tamein. Again, there's a lot of ways of explaining this. I'm going to do for this case the Tiferes Yisrael, who says this is really, most Mefarshim say this is a padlock. A padlock is made of two parts, the bottom part in which you turn the key, then you have the arch on top, the ring, which goes click. These are two separate pieces which put together create a padlock. Tiferes Yisrael says, hapin v'hapurno tamein, each separate bit, the pin and the purna. The purna, I think, is the bottom one. The pin is the bits on top, the two pins literally that go inside. Each one by itself is tomei because they do have a separate function. They're not regarded as being one kli. And therefore the pin and or the purna by themselves are tomei because that's called yesh le'shem ifnei atzmai. What this din of pin purna tamein is doing in the middle of this Mishnah, I do not know. And now we come to the last bit of the Mishnah, which is actually very tricky. But I will try and shortcut it and give it as simple. Klustra. We're back to our klustra, our bolt, our neger, with the rounded edge. And we said before that it's, although the neger by itself is Torah because it's nasal chabim makaraka, when it has a rounded edge, and that can be used as one of the kitchen utensils for pounding herbs, then it would assume the din of a kli matchas of the kitchen and be mikabel tuma. Says the Mishnah, not so simple. What we're going to do now is move over to Hilchas Shabbos and use Hilchas Shabbos to determine a din of Hilchas Tuma. And the basic rule is, which is a memra of Rava in Shabbos Daf Kuf Chav Daled, when dealing with muktzah on Shabbos, if something is a kli, it's not muktzah. If something is not a kli, it is muktzah. Rava says the same din, you can use Shabbos to determine the Tumah. In other words, if something is muktzah on Shabbos, that means it's not a kli, and therefore for kelim, for Tumah, it would not be makabel Tumah. However, if something is not muktzah on Shabbos, that means it is a kli, it is therefore makabel Tumah. And that comparison is what Baal Tanura and other Rishonim say is what's happening in the next part of the Mishnah. We'll do the Mishnah and then we'll explain that it's not literally as simple as it looks, and the Mishnah actually means something else. Says the Mishnah, Klustra. We have a machlokes. Rabbi Shu'ema, he says the Klustra is muktzah on Shabbos, and you can't lift it up and move it along. If you want to move it from one door to another, it's going to be dragged across the floor. You can't just lift it up. In other words, Rabbi Shua holds it's muktzah. There's a bit of a problem here. Just because something is muktzah, you can't really drag it along the floor either. Try and come back to that. But Rabbi Shua holds it's muktzah. And therefore, says Baal Tanura, if he holds it's muktzah, it's because he holds it's not a kli. And if it's not a kli, he will argue with the previous Mishnah that said, sorry, the Mishnah just before, which said that a klustra is tomei, because he holds it's not a kli, it's muktzah, and therefore is tahor. It's like any other kli, and it can be moved around the garden no problem at all, because Rabbi Tarfon holds that it is not muktzah because it is a kli, and that's why Rabbi Tarfon is the one who said before the klustra is tomei because it is a kli on its own right as a kitchen utensil. Now this Mishnah is actually quite difficult to understand because, first of all, if something is muktzah, you can't drag it across the ground. And there are many other questions in this Mishnah. And according to Rabbi Yeshua, why is it muktzah? If you can use it as a neger or which as a klustra, whichever way it is, why should it actually be muktzah? In a nutshell, the way you've got to learn this Mishnah is like this. There was a time when they were very strict on muktzah. They forbade all kelim, even kelim which are mutter. They said, it's called, there was a time called kodim ataras kelim. All kelim were muktzah unless they were kitchen utensils, unless they were klei suda. And this Mishnah is going according to that period of halacha when all kelim were muktzah. And that's what Rabbi Yeshua holds. Rabbi Yeshua holds that in that period, this klustra, which is a bolt and is also possibly used as a kitchen utensil, he held the ikka was not the kitchen utensil part, it was the other part, it was the bolt part. And therefore it had a din of muktzah. Under the rules of muktzah then, for those type of kelim, you were allowed to drag it across the ground. But the main point of Rabbi Yeshua is that it was muktzah, that you went according to the ikar of the kli, which he held was not the cluster part, the bit used for pounding herbs. It was the bolt part of the kli. That was the main part of the kli, and the rounded edge was not important. Therefore, according to Rabbi Yeshua, the ikar was the bolt, and because the ikar was the bolt, we know before a bolt is tahor because nasa lechabe im karka, sticking on a round edge doesn't help, doesn't change it. Therefore, according to Rabbi Yeshua, taka a klustra doesn't change the position of a neger, it's still a neger and it's tahor. Rabbi Tarfon says, in those days, before it was called kלים ataras kelim, Rabbi Tarfon held you were still allowed to move the klustra because the ikka was the klustra, the ikka was the rounded ball at the top, because that was made for pounding herbs, and therefore is considered to be a kli suda. Rabbi Tarfon held that was the ikka of the kli, and therefore was not muktzah. Therefore, the relevance is today when we're dealing with hilchas tumah, because that's the ikka of the kli. Therefore, we don't say it's nasa lechabe im karka and tor. It's actually a regular klei suda, and is therefore tomei. Therefore, the Mishnah, which said before klustera tomea, is in fact Rabbi Tarfon. And that's the end of that difficult Mishnah.